Hello, bruvs. We're back with The Madness of Mary Lincoln by Jason Emerson. A 2000 and what year? 6, 5? 2007 book. It was close. Chapter 7. No more insane than I am. That Mary Lincoln and the Bradwells knew they must harness the power of the popular press and public sentiment to aid in the widow's release was evident in Mary's first request to speak with the Chicago Times in July 1875. Yet, between the July 13th Post and Mail story and James Bradwell's acrimonious reply to Dr. Patterson's August 18 letter, the papers were strangely devoid of any mention of the widow's plight at Bellevue Place. Even Times editor Frank Wilkie, after 2 hours of conversation with Mary on August 7, had published nothing. All of this changed, however, when the Bradwells found their suggestions rejected and their visits and letters forbidden by Robert Lincoln. Since they could no longer lobby privately for Mary's release, they decided to do so publicly. For the next 2 weeks, Mary Lincoln's situation was in the local and national newspapers almost every day. Without consulting Dr. Patterson or Robert Lincoln, the Bradwells leaked to the Post and Mail that Mary Lincoln was partially restored to health, would go visit her sister in Springfield, and might not return to the sanitarium at all. The paper's August 21st edition stated, "A legal lady of Chicago and her husband had taken steps for Mary's release, it being implied that her contemplated visit to Springfield was the result of their friendly, if not professional, intercourse." The Associated Press repeated the news the next day, as did the Chicago Tribune, saying it would be received with pleasure by everyone, especially by those friends of Mary who opposed her incarceration in the first place. Leaking this false information to the press was only the opening effort. On August 23rd, Judge Bradwell, all right, it is focusing. Judge Bradwell gave an interview with the Post and Mail, during which he repeatedly complained that Mary was the sane victim of an unjust confinement. Mrs. Lincoln ought not to be where she is now, and never ought to have been placed there. It was a gross outrage to imprison her there, behind gates and bars, in a place understood to be for mad people. Why to be so shut up and guarded and locked up at night, with the feeling that it may last for life, is enough to make almost any aged and delicate woman crazy. She is no more insane today than you and I are. Bradwell said Mary had asked him what she had done to deserve such a fate, complained that she was not insane, but soon would be, and insisted that she did not want to be a prisoner. Interestingly, Bradwell did not attack or blame Robert Lincoln in any way during his interview, but instead denounced Dr. Patterson as a man with suspicious motives who needlessly uh, censored Mary's mail and was opposed to her freedom. Bradwell also tempered his rhetoric to say that he hoped Mary's release could be achieved amicably, but that he was prepared to initiate startling developments if she stayed at Bellevue Place much longer. He modestly declined to specify what those developments would be, saying, "Let her get out of danger first." With this interview, James Bradwell showed himself to be a formidable adversary. He made Mary's case sound dire and desperate, implying that she was suffering and in danger, and that her jailer was needlessly apathetic. He characterized himself as a concerned friend who was acting with candor and credibility, but was too much of a gentleman to offer threats. Perhaps more important, he set his condemnation on Dr. Patterson and not Robert Lincoln. This was a plan executed with acumen. The American public would not have tolerated an attack on Robert Lincoln. He was the only surviving son of the martyred president who had endured his father's assassination and his mother's insanity trial, but with nothing but sympathy and respect from the public. He also was a well respected Chicago attorney who would have defended himself much more deftly than Dr. Patterson did. And Robert would have been supported by numerous political luminaries, including President Ulysses S. Grant. No, to accuse Dr. Patterson of mistreatment was a clever and much safer plan to evoke sympathy for the widow's cause. The next day, August 24th, Frank Wilkie published in the Chicago Times the account on his July 7 interview with Mary Lincoln. The headline read, "Reason Restored. Mrs. Lincoln will soon return from her brief visit to the insane asylum, for her physicians pronounce her sane, as those who sent her there, and she is only awaiting Robert's return from the East to set her free again." The story purported to be an independent analysis of Mary's health through scientific facts based on personal observation by a reporter who went to Bellevue Place not as a newspaper man, but as a gentleman who knew her history and took a friendly interest in all that pertained to her welfare. Of course, the historical evidence proves that Wilkie was invited there by Mary Lincoln and Maya Bradwell to carry out a specific agenda as a reporter to condemn the sanitarium and exonerate the beleaguered widow from the accusation of insanity. The Times' disingenuousness went even further, however, when it farcically claimed a mutual friend who happened to be there at the same time had introduced its reporter to Mary. As Mary and Myra intended, the story was written and timed for maximum impact and did not disappoint in its sensationalism. The Times declared that its correspondent became convinced that Mary's mind was in a perfectly sound and healthy condition, and there was not a sign of weakness or any abnormal manifestations of mind visible. It reported that Mary attributed her pretrial behavior in Florida to fever and a shattered nervous system, but that now she was in perfect mental and physical health and ought not to be deprived of her liberty. The story also contained an interview with Myra Bradwell, who avowed that she was extremely reluctant to talk about such a private subject, but who then proceeded to echo her husband's statements that Mary was the sane victim of a cruel doctor. I was inexpressibly shocked when I learned of her alleged insanity and of her confinement in an asylum at Batavia, Bradwell said. During her stay in Florida, I received many long and beautifully written letters from her. I wondered what could have occurred to have unbalanced her mind so suddenly. Here, Myra Bradwell cleverly did not judge Mary's state of mind at the time of the trial, but simply said that by late August she considered Mary recovered. "She is no more insane than I am," Myra declared. She also repeated her husband's statements that Elizabeth Edwards was prepared to receive her sister into her home, and all that was needed was the return of Robert Lincoln from the East. Myra slyly added that Robert had told her he would allow his mother's release and that she had no reason in the world to doubt Mr. Robert Lincoln's word. Myra Bradwell was being especially selective with her word choice here. Robert's letters all show he consented to a visit, not a release. Myra's words took on added weight that day when the Chicago Times, calling her a lady of prominence and unquestioned veracity, espoused her case on its editorial page. "The case is a peculiarly sad one," the paper declared, "but if Mrs. Lincoln has since recovered her right mind and is being held in duress unlawfully and without good cause, the public will unite, not untie, in a demand for her release." As her husband had done, Myra Bradwell showed that she too was a shrewd antagonist. She upheld the contemporary standard of appropriate female decency and reticence by regretting the publicity of Mary's case at the same time that she continued the accusations against Dr. Patterson. Most important, she not only avoided condemning Robert Lincoln, but praised him as an honorable man, making it impossible for Robert to oppose his mother's freedom without dishonoring himself. As it happened, Robert's rebuttal was unnecessary. Newspapers across the country, echoing public sentiments, immediately attacked the Bradwells and the Chicago Times for their meddling. The Springfield, Illinois Journal called the Bradwells busybodies whose attacks upon Mary's family, friends, and physicians were an extremely injudicious as well as an unfeeling and gratuitous outrage. The Boston Globe agreed and said the Bradwells' accusations were not borne out by the facts and are known to be utterly untrue. The Chicago Tribune called the situation an atrocious libel upon Mary's family and friends. It decried the scandal that had been set afloat by over officious and intermeddling mischief makers who interfered in a matter which did not concern them for purposes of sensation. Another newspaper called the story a contemptible fiction and foul scandal that insulted Robert Lincoln and recommended that he contemplate legal action. The St. Louis Republican reported that Mary's relatives in Springfield, Illinois, were greatly annoyed by the Bradwells' public statements, and that Myra Bradwell's visits were worsening the widow's condition. Mary's relatives were in fact indignant at the Bradwells, according to Dr. Patterson. He wrote Robert that Elizabeth Edwards' two daughters visited Mary on August 19 and told the physicians that they are satisfied with what has been done in Mrs. Lincoln's case and would feel obliged to Mrs. B if she would mind her own business and not meddle with Mrs. L. They say also that Mrs. B wrote a very mean letter to Mrs. Edwards, and I understood them to intimate that she charged unkind or improper treatment toward Mrs. L while here. Mary's old friend and pastor, Professor David Swing, tried to be a voice of moderation in the debate. He called Mary's weakness of mind a temporary occurrence during the spring and said she was sufficiently recovered to leave Bellevue Place. He tried to dispel the accusations of conspiracy by saying that attorneys Leonard Swett and Isaac Arnold were too noble to do such a thing. He also defended Robert. There is room in this matter for an immense amount of injustice to be done Robert Lincoln, and we hope the public will decline accepting the opportunity, Swing wrote. The Chicago Times supported Swing's statement and editorialized that since Mary's episode was only temporary, to continue her confinement would be nothing less than unlawful restraint. The Times also took a swipe at the Chicago Tribune, saying it had been guilty of scandalous vituperation of the trustworthy Bradwells, while it ignorantly persisted in calling Mary a lunatic. The Tribune will do well not to permit its zeal to outrun decency and discretion, it stated. Hello, Brobs. What do you got? Most interesting, however, was the degree to which the Times had become invested in the story. It warned the Tribune and indirectly Robert Lincoln that there were many facts in reference to Mary Lincoln's prolonged confinement that, if made public, would not reflect credit upon parties who are closely related to it as principals. At this point, Dr. Patterson decided to enter the fray with a letter to the editor of the Chicago Tribune. One by one, Patterson rebutted every accusation made by the Bradwells concerning improper incarceration, locked doors, barred windows, and unnecessary restraint. Don't ever ask that again. He called their assertion that he signed the certificate declaring Mary fully recovered as untrue. I don't know why people keep asking if I'm reading the Bible. I know it's some kind of meme thing, but it disgusts me. It's stupid. She is certainly much improved. Why would I ever read the Bible? She is certainly much improved, both mentally and physically, but I have not at any time regarded her as a person of sound mind. He wrote, I believe her to be now insane. Patterson also said he was not opposed to Mary going to Springfield to live with her sister, but her condition was such that he did not think it would work. The experiment, if made, will result only in giving the coveted opportunity to make extended rambles, to renew the indulgence of her purchasing mania and other morbid mental manifestations, he wrote. Judge Bradwell's August 19 letter threatening a writ of habeas corpus clearly did not intimidate Patterson. In fact, Patterson practically dared Bradwell to try it, for he concluded his letter by saying, Mrs. Lincoln has been placed where she is under the forms of law, and if any have grievance, the law is open to them. Thanks, Brav. Not to be outdone, the Bradwells responded by releasing the correspondence between Judge Bradwell and Dr. Patterson, which was published in the Chicago Tribune the next day. It seems to have had little, if any, effect, however, as no articles or editorials about the controversy occurred in the Chicago papers over the next few days. That did not mean that the Bradwells were done fighting. They simply switched to a different tactic. As public sentiment had turned against them, the Bradwells' next publicity effort was anonymous and in a different newspaper. It was their most sensationalist, mendacious, and audacious endeavor to date. Headlined, Mrs. Lincoln is the widow of President Lincoln a prisoner. No one allowed to see her except by order of her son. The article was a first-person narrative by a lady of this city who has for many years been an intimate friend of Mrs. Lincoln. The narrator stated it was her first visit to Bellevue Place and her first attempt to contact Mrs. Lincoln since before the trial. I had no object in my view in making this visit except to satisfy myself in regard to Mrs. Lincoln's insanity, of which so many of late have expressed doubts. Yet when, at the front door, she asked Dr. Patterson's permission to visit the former First Lady, his expression became flinty, and he refused unless she had permission from Robert Lincoln. She may be out in a few days, and you can see her to your heart's content, he said. He would also not allow the anonymous narrator to leave a note saying it would only disturb his patient's mind. If she is only permitted to see such persons as you choose and not permitted to receive letters except from such, she is virtually a prisoner, is she not? The narrator accused. Madam, she is no more so than any other patients I have under my care, Patterson supposedly replied. The narrator then sat, first on the outside stoop and then inside a parlor, to pass the time until leaving to catch her train back to Chicago. She wondered at the emptiness of the place. Supposing the stories that Patterson's patients were free to roam his house must be an erroneous impression of a good-natured public. She also decided that if she were placed in such a place by friends or family, either to get rid of her or because they truly believed her insane, it would take but a few days to make a raving maniac of me. Other newspapers quickly exposed Myra Bradwell's ruse, however, and her meddling and was publicly condemned. When Robert Lincoln returned to Chicago on September 1st, he was confronted by what he termed the extraordinary performances of the Bradwells. He had not even had time to digest them, however, before writing a letter to Dr. Patterson asking for the physician's opinion on the safety of moving Mary Lincoln to Springfield. It is unlikely that the actions of the Bradwells precipitated this letter, as Robert said. He hadn't read the newspapers yet. Most likely, Robert had been considering the experiment. of his mother's move to Springfield for the entire 2 weeks of his vacation. Robert Lincoln was not the type of man to be pressured by others. He was intelligent, self assured, well connected, and, as one historian wrote, he had his father's fine, far seeing judgment, one of the rarest of human qualities. Rather than being afraid of or outwitted by the Bradwells, as some have contended, Robert simply realized that there was no return to a simple, quiet stay at Bellevue Place for his mother. Mary was now constantly agitated by the promise of Springfield and would only continue to be agitated even if all communication with and knowledge of the Bradwells were stopped. In such a state of constant ferment, her health would fail to improve and perhaps would decline. Even Dr. Patterson told Robert, "Now that so much is said about Mrs. Lincoln's removal to Springfield, I think it would be well if she could go at once." It's page 100 already. For such a step as removing his mother from professional care, Robert did not want to rely solely on Dr. Patterson's opinion of Mary's condition. He wrote to Dr. Andrew McFarland, superintendent of the Jacksonville, Illinois State Hospital for the Insane, and Dr. Alexander McDill, superintendent of the Madison, Wisconsin State Hospital for the Insane, requesting they examine Mary Lincoln and offer their opinions on the safety of her removal from Bellevue Place. As a guest of her sister, I do not think it possible that the same restraint could be exercised over possible irrational acts, should they occur, as if she remained under the care of Dr. Patterson. Robert wrote, "But I am anxious that she should visit my aunt. If it is not probable that harm to her may come of it." McDill could not travel to Bellevue Place in a timely manner, but McFarland arrived 4 days after receiving Robert's letter. He found Mary's condition such as to cause him grave apprehensions as to the result, unless the utmost quietude is observed for the few ensuing months, beyond which all reasonable hope of restoration must be abandoned. McFarland did not think it wise to let Mary go to Springfield unless she was constantly under the care of an attendant. But even then he saw no good results likely to follow beyond gratifying an ardent desire to go, in which she seems to have been prompted by others. My fears are that a desire for further adventure will take possession of her mind as soon as beyond the control of the present guardians of her safety that may be attended with hazard if gratified. Despite McFarland's opinion, Robert decided to make the experiment immediately. He told Dr. Patterson to prepare Mary for the journey and to allow her to bring only 3 trunks of possessions. Mary Lincoln left Bellevue Place Sanitarium on September 10th, 1875, a little less than 4 months after her trial and commitment. She was accompanied by one of the Bellevue Place female attendants to Chicago, where she met Robert, and another female attendant sent by Dr. McFarland met her at Springfield the next day to act as her personal nurse. According to Myra Bradwell's granddaughters, Mary Lincoln went directly to my grandmother's home in Chicago and remained there some time before joining her sister, Mrs. Edwards, in Springfield. The historical evidence does not bear out this assertion. However, the Chicago Tribune reported that Mary Lincoln met Robert at the Chicago train station, spent the night, and arrived in Springfield on the morning of September 11. While it is possible that Robert allowed his mother to spend her first night out of the sanitarium at the Bradwell home on Michigan Avenue, considering all the trouble the couple caused, it is highly unlikely that Robert would have taken his mother there. Mary's trip to Springfield was a visit, not a relocation. It was, as all parties involved called it, an experiment to test Mary's reaction. Elizabeth Edwards thought it would be good for Mary to be with family and friends, But Robert did not expect much. He had been telling his mother for years that she should reconnect with estranged acquaintances, but was always rebuffed. He told his aunt this and explained his negative expectations. I cannot have any confidence in her sincerity in this, and I do not believe that if her object was accomplished, she would receive a call from any one of her sisters. Keep this letter and see if I am not correct, he admonished. But at first he was not correct. After 3 days in Springfield, Mary was happy and agreeable, willing to take walks and rides, and overall seemed delighted to visit friends and family. I can truly say that she never appeared to better advantage than she does now, Elizabeth wrote her nephew. Robert's aunt was also Robert's aunt also revealed exactly why, after 10 years of estrangement, she had accepted her sister into her home. Insanity, although a new feature in our family, first appeared within my knowledge in the case of my own daughter at the age of 13, she confided. At the birth of each child, the same symptoms were shown and severely felt, particularly by her husband and myself. God pity those who are the victims and who are the anxious sufferers in such terrible afflictions. Historian Michael Burlingame recently has uncovered evidence that psychiatric illness actually ran deep in the Todd family. Mary's grandfather, Levi Owen Todd, brother Levi, niece Maddie Todd, and grandniece Georgie Edward all died in insane asylums. 14 members of the Canfield family, cousins, were in various asylums. Mary's brother George suffered depression, and her grandniece Nellie Canfield committed suicide. Dr. Patterson and Robert Lincoln, however, were more interested in Mary's health and well being than in pitying her. They both had a duty to perform. For Robert, it was nothing less than deciding whether or not his mother was better served at Bellevue Place or at the Edwards home. On September 20, 10 days into Mary's visit, he requested Dr. Patterson's opinion on Mary's condition and on the safety of her permanent removal to Springfield. I am not able to report much change in the mental condition of Mrs. Lincoln since you last saw her, the physician wrote. I do not hesitate to say that as a result of her intercourse with Judge and Mrs. Bradwell, she became worse, and since they have ceased their visits, she is again better and improving. As to her permanent removal to Springfield, since she has complied with all the conditions placed upon her to achieve the move, I suppose the experiment ought to be made. After this letter, the widow's return to Bellevue Place was postponed indefinitely. Mary Lincoln may have achieved her freedom from the sanitarium, but her legal status remained the same. She still was legally insane, and Robert still was her conservator. Under state law, there was no way to change that fact until at least 1 year after her commitment trial. This fact bothered Mary. It constantly ate at her mind. Still, her first months at the Edwards home were characterized by an improvement in her condition. We take daily rides, and your mother enjoys, without a doubt, the change in her habits. Elizabeth Edwards reported in late September. She has dined at Mrs. Smith's, taken tea at our sister Frances's, and received every visitor with a manifestation of cheerfulness and pleasure, as has surprised me. Thus far, she has shown herself very clear headed. These good tidings must have continued through October and into early November, as no letters from that period are known to exist. Robert may have been as surprised as his aunt concerning his mother's uncharacteristic goodwill to family and friends, but more than likely he was not. Her course since the Inquisition has shown that, in general, she is able to control her impulses if she has an object in doing so. Robert wrote to David Davis in November. In this case, her object was to spite the son who had locked her up and to a lesser degree, the physician who kept her locked up. Both men made it clear that they did not expect Mary's temperament or condition to change in Springfield, and Robert explicitly told his aunts to expect his mother to isolate herself. No doubt Elizabeth Edwards shared Robert's assessment with her sister. As Robert stated, since the trial, his mother constantly kept in view her discharge, and her actions since then were calculated to facilitate that discharge. By September, with her discharge achieved, Mary's next goal was to prove Robert's opinions about her wrong. Her resentment toward her son was visibly growing, and Elizabeth Edwards suggested that Robert stop alluding to his belief in his mother's insanity where she could hear it or read it, as it only upset her. By November 1875, Mary had a new goal, the return of her right to control her property. Robert's conservatorship was very galling to Mary's proud spirit. Elizabeth Edwards told her nephew, and she suggested that Mary should be allowed to control her own interests. Surely, the evidence of derangement exhibited last spring must have arisen from physical disorder. She informs me that her health was poor before going to Florida, and during her stay there and on her return was often conscious of the presence of fever. Moreover, had used chloral very freely for the purpose of inducing sleep. Those causes had doubtless much to do with producing the sad result. In fact, in her 2 months with the Edwardses, Mary had acted more reasonable and gentle than in former years, her sister reported. I have no hesitation in pronouncing her sane. Elizabeth also reported that Mary's purchasing of unnecessary items was not excessive compared to what the widow could afford. She suggested Robert assume indifference to his mother's spending and thereby regain her affection and ultimately some influence in her pecuniary affairs. Above all, do everything that will conciliate and make her as happy as it would be possible to render her, for she has indulged her morbid ways so long that it is impossible to prevent frequent reactions to extreme sadness. Elizabeth here unwittingly offered further testimony to Mary's bipolar disorder, describing classic symptoms of recurring episodes of depression, frequent reactions to extreme sadness, punctuated by periods of normalcy, and still demonstrating, at least at times, a mania to shop. By early November, Mary grew increasingly agitated, even irritable, whenever the subject of her property was broached. The issue was the Edwardses' only concern, and it began to surface, much like Mary's ardent desire for freedom, the previous July with a letter to James Bradwell. Unlike the Bradwells' summer intervention at the sanitarium, their damning influence in November was not because of their care for Mary, but because of their neglect. They had not written or visited Mary once in the 2 months since her release from Bellevue Place. Mary reopened communication with the Bradwells on November 11th. A long and weary time has passed since I last saw you, she wrote, knowing well the interest you have taken in my sad. I feel assured that you will be pleased to hear that I am in perfect health. The purpose of her letter was to request Judge Bradwell to send her the will he had drawn up for her in 1873, in which she gave Robert and his children all her possessions. This was the important document that Dr. Patterson asked Bradwell to return to Mary in mid-August. There is no indication in the letter why Mary wanted her will, but Elizabeth Edwards assumed, and the extant documentary record suggests it was so she could cut Robert out. What can I say to your dear wife? Mary rhapsodized. The sorrow which has been mine for the last 6 months has been in a measure alleviated by the friendship of such noble hearts as yours. This letter contains the only evidence suggesting that perhaps one of the conditions put on Mary by Robert and Dr. Patterson in exchange for her removal from Batavia to Springfield was a termination of her association with the troublemaking Bradwells. I feel assured you will reply to this note at once without even mentioning that you have heard from me, Mary wrote, suggesting her communication was in fact illicit. She closed her letter with the postscript: write me quietly, both of you, given the Bradwells' zealous efforts to advocate Mary's sanity and release from Bellevue. The fact that James Bradwell waited 1 month to respond to Mary's letter is difficult to comprehend. Was he abiding by an agreement, or, as critical newspapers had charged he would, had he lost interest in Mary's situation because the sensation was over? Whatever the reason, his silence clearly piqued Mary. She posted him a second, more terse note 3 weeks later, repeating her request for the will, coldly signing it Mrs. A. Lincoln rather than her usual Mary Lincoln. This reaction was in keeping with Mary's petulance. As Julia Taft Bain said of Mary during the White House years, she wanted what she wanted when she wanted it. In this case, she wanted to renew communication with her old friends. Whether James Bradwell's silence was well or ill intentioned, the fact that he was not doing what Mary wanted him to do offended her. Bradwell did finally send her the document in mid December. After that brief exchange, no further correspondence had ever been found. The couple's silence has created one of the enduring mysteries of the insanity case. After their enormous efforts to free Mary from the sanitarium, why did Myra and James Bradwell abandon her? None of the previously known insanity file materials or any of Mary's known letters explained why. The discovery of Mary's lost letters, however, finally illuminates the truth. The tower's trunk contained 10 letters from Mary Lincoln to Myra Bradwell during a period of more than 2 years after the conclusion of Mary's institutionalization episode, proving that their friendship did in fact continue. It strengthens the surmise that the Bradwells agreed to a cessation of communication with Mary Lincoln for as long as she was considered legally insane. The theory further is bolstered by the fact that the day after Mary Lincoln was declared sane in June 1876, Myra Bradwell immediately broke her 9 month silence and wrote her vindicated friend a letter. The two women then kept in contact to it until at least July 1878, the date of the final letter discovered in the tower's trunk, and probably until Mary's death in 1882. But in November 1875, Judge Bradwell's silence, in essence another abandonment combined with her anger over Robert's conservatorship, precipitated Mary's next psychotic episode. After her letters to Judge Bradwell, Mary grew increasingly upset at her son. Her behavior thereafter could almost be dubbed compartmentalized. She was cheerful, polite, affectionate, and agreeable, often taking rides and making visits, and gives less trouble than any person I ever knew until the subject of her property came up, according to Ninian Edwards. The idea that Robert controlled her bonds and had possession of most of her trunks made her impatient and incensed. Duh. I am convinced that the only alternative in this case, for the sake of peace and quietness, will be to yield your mother the right to control her possessions. Elizabeth wrote Robert in mid November. You will understand that she is now pressing this matter until the unpleasantness is such that I am constrained to make the plea. Mary had even suggested that if returned to her, she would leave her bonds in possession of Jacob Bunn, a prominent Springfield banker, to be undisturbed during her life. This last matter was Robert's main concern. He did not trust his mother's judgment in financial matters and would not allow her the power of impoverishing herself. As her son and male head of the family, and temporarily her conservator, he was responsible for her conduct and her physical and financial security. There is no person upon whom lies the responsibility and duty of protecting her when she needs it, except myself, Robert wrote his uncle. But he agreed that he wanted every liberty and privilege restored to his mother as soon as it was safe to do so. I want to do everything I can, which is really for her happiness, and I have no wish to interfere with her expenditures further than to ensure her having money to expend as long as she lives, Robert continued. But if there is danger of her expending her capital, and we should countlessly ignore it or imprudently contribute to it, and she should impoverish herself, we would be severely censured. There were not only emotional issues involved in charging his mother's situation, but legal, financial, and social issues as well. First of all, it was not even clear if Robert legally could return his mother's power of possession to her. The entire point of the conservatorship was to keep the responsibility away from those declared insane. Second, Robert had posted a bond as conservator, backed financially by two sureties for $150,000. This was insurance against his mother's estate. If Robert, as the conservator, spent all his ward's money, that $150,000 bond would repay the loss. Robert was concerned that if Mary regained control of her estate while he was still conservator, she could spend her entire fortune before she was legally released from the conservatorship. If that happened, Robert and his friends would be obligated to repay that bond to Mary. Not only could the widow bankrupt herself due to her mental illness, Robert knew that in her exasperation at him, she also could do it out of spite. Her anger toward Robert was undeniable by this time, and what better way to make him pay for her commitment than to publicly humiliate him by bankrupting him and his friends? There was also the social issue of Robert's duty to his mother. He could not allow her to impoverish herself, not more simply to make a public spectacle of herself as she had done during the old clothes scandal. Such a spectacle would embarrass her husband's memory, and her son. The amount of pressure Robert felt at this time must have been enormous. He was dealing with his mother, his law practice, his family, and in early November, the birth of his third child, Jesse Lincoln. Robert did not wish to decide his mother's future without the advice of others, so he once again turned to his father's friends, David Davis, Leonard Swett, and John Todd Stewart. You know the whole story, and you can judge as well as anyone what would be the consequences to my mother of erroneous action on my part at this time, he wrote to Stewart. To Davis, Robert wrote with more candor, saying his aunt clearly did not understand the severity of his mother's condition, and even blaming her for Mary's release from Bellevue Place. Elizabeth Edwards' mentions of Mary's purchases, wrote Robert, was a clear indication to him that no radical change has taken place since last spring, but only opportunity is wanting to develop the same trouble. Robert and Swett had discussed four possible actions to take, which he explained to Davis. 1. To remove all restraints upon travel and residence. 2. To pay to her to be expended by herself without scrutiny of any kind, her whole income in monthly installments at the present rate of gold, and including a payment from me to her of $120 per $5 per month, which will end April 1881. This monthly income will be about $700. To have 3. To have a competent person make an estimate on the annuity principle of what monthly sum can be paid her during her life so as to leave nothing at her death, and if Judge Wallace will consent to pay such sum to her monthly. in addition to 1 and 2, or to 1 and 3, to deliver her as being necessary for her comfort all of her personal effects, which consist of clothing and jewelry. The problem with number 3, Robert believed, was that the permanence of her yearly pension provided by Congress was uncertain. Robert's correspondence with Davis at this time gives further insight into his sense of manly duty toward his mother. Essentially, his aunt had advised him to let his mother do whatever she wanted, be it shopping, controlling her money, or traveling. Life had taught her, she said, that when you have done all you could for people, let them be. The trouble in my case is that I cannot abandon the matter if I would, Robert complained. The time will not come when I can end the trouble by saying, I have done what I can, and if I let it alone, it would not let me alone. Davis agreed with Robert on all counts. You cannot escape responsibility if you wanted to, and it would be esteemed by the world bad conduct if you should try, Davis wrote. Elizabeth Edwards had no conception of Mary's real troubles, and her advice of indifference was grounded on a total misapprehension of the relations between parent and child. He recommended that Robert remove all restraints on his mother's travel and residence, return all her personal effects, and pay her the monthly income from her bonds. If she had remained undisturbed at Batavia, there might have been a chance for her recovery, but I fear the intermeddling will prove disastrous to her, as it has already added to your trouble. Davis wrote, I think your mother would rest satisfied if unrestrained and paid her income in monthly installments. Robert took Davis's advice and gave his mother everything she requested of him, including 11 trunks of clothing and a box of jewelry, except the power to control her bonds. But this did nothing to lessen her anger or excitability. Your mother, for the last 2 or 3 weeks, has been very much embittered against you, Ninian Edwards told Robert. And the more you have yielded, the more immeasurable she seems to be. She also was demanding more money and more of her trunks from Robert and continuing her unnecessary purchases. What concerned the Edwardses, however, was that Mary was giving away money and possessions that either belonged to Robert or would be part of his eventual inheritance. Both Ninian and Elizabeth were shocked by this behavior and mentioned in separate letters they believed Robert should not be robbed of his future. Ironically, subsequent historians have accused Robert of being the thief, motivated in the insanity case solely out of rapaciousness to control his mother's money and protect his inheritance. I agree. His letters prove this to be a fallacy. In a letter to David Davis, whom Robert considered a second father, and whom he trusted above all of others, he said he had no interest in her property and assumed she had already arranged to cut him out of her will. In response to his aunt and uncle's concerns about Mary's property, he wrote, I do not desire that any interest of mine or my children in the ultimate disposition of her property should be consulted, and the only object I wish attained by any plan is her own protection. 5 months later, when Robert was told his mother planned to bankrupt herself to prevent her son's inheritance, he suggested that the sane way to punish him would be to cut him out of her will. This possibility of disinheritance did not affect Robert, who achieved his own financial stability as a Chicago attorney, nor would it dissuade him from doing his duty. She has always been exceedingly generous to me, he told his uncle. I am exceedingly gratified to her for it all, and shall never hesitate to acknowledge it, but being grateful merely will not discharge my duty to her, if necessary against her will. Hello, Robs. By December, as Mary's anger continued to grow, she threatened to hire an attorney to overturn Robert's conservatorship and, in the legal process, make public the past 10 years of their personal relations. She threatened to expose bad business investments Robert had sought to involve her in as a way to embarrass him, But Robert was unconcerned since the accusation was not true. Ninian Edwards tried to dissuade Mary from taking such a legal route, but by late December she had arranged for attorney John M. Palmer, a former Illinois governor, to relieve her of her situation. Despite what both Robert and Ninian Edwards told her, she simply would not believe that Robert had no legal discretion to restore her rights. Her fixation on the subject was increasing so feverishly that Robert not only asked Palmer to explain a conservator's rights to his mother, but also offered to resign his position if Palmer was willing to replace him. With this offer, Robert once again proved he would do whatever was necessary to relieve his mother of her mental burdens. By the end of the year, Mary's major aggravation in the eyes of Ninian and Elizabeth Edwards was the subject of her bonds. It is impossible to reason with her on the subject, they wrote Robert. She is much exasperated against you. In all other ways, she was cheerful, gregarious, social, and active. Although her amount of shopping was increasing, they both repeatedly told Robert that only restoring Mary's bonds to her possession would calm her and diminish her bitterness. Still, Elizabeth and Ninian Edwards considered the widow completely restored to sanity, and they seemed relatively unconcerned by her behavior. That is, until they found her gun. Oh no, not the fucking gun. Oh shit. She's got a gun. Mary's got a gun. Hell no. Alright. That's all until next time. That's a nice cliffhanger. Unexpected, but a nice cliffhanger.